What's up, guys? Coming at you from Shenzhen again, as usual. Another rainy day, but it's looking a lot nicer. The rain has cleared up the fog or smog, whatever it was. I didn't look at the PMI levels, but it's looking pretty good today. And I am recaffeinating myself again, this time with a yellow tea. Oh, that's really good. This is a yellow tea from Anhui. It's called Huoshan Huangya. And actually, if I were to say there was one province that was underrated for good teas, it's Anhui. Really good yellow teas. The red teas, Qi Men Hong Cha. Green tea is one of my favorites, the Lu An Gua Pian. It's to the point where I've even had to convince some of my Anhui friends who almost exclusively drink teas from Fujian province that they're really missing out. But it's so good. All right, what am I going to talk about today? I'm not going to talk about coronavirus. As a matter of fact, I didn't even look at the numbers this morning, and kind of burnt out by it, but I'll look at them later and then continue with some coronavirus related videos another time. What I wanted to do now was continue on from the last video, because in the last video I alluded to the fact that I would talk a little bit more about why I make the content I make, what drives me. And I want to keep this video short. That's not going to happen though, is it? I always say that. We already know that's not going to happen. Actually, if we're going to draw some benefit from yesterday's video about critical thinking, you should ask yourself, why am I going to trust a guy who keeps telling me he's going to make short videos and he never does? It's a valid question and I don't know the answer to, but I'll still continue anyways. Yeah, in regards to talking about why I make the content I want to make. Originally, I wanted to write something out and make it a little bit more detailed to make sure I don't forget anything. And I thought, nah, you know what, I'm just going to do it on the fly, like a conversation. I probably will miss some stuff, and if I'm not happy with it afterwards, maybe down the road I'll do a more detailed one to cover all the points that I want to cover. But I want to just try to quickly go through a few of the reasons, because there's quite a few. So first and foremost, a gap. I feel like there's a gap missing where foreigners who are giving an honest take on what the good things are here in China is missing. There are a few, and some of them seem a little bit intense, extreme, crazy, whatever word you want to use. And so I want to add something else. That's not to say maybe I'm the crazy one. So I'm going to put it out there according to my version of normal, which may be somebody else's version of crazy, of course. It was Jim Jeffries who said, that's the thing about crazy people. You don't know that you're crazy, right? From my point of view, from my version of normal, the things that drive me, one of the things is that, yeah, there's a big gap missing where people are talking in an honest way about the positives here. And maybe it's almost like an OCD thing, where if you see something out of place, you just got to fix it. And that's what I feel like a little bit I'm doing here. And the implications of that gap also is what drives me, because I feel that gap is offensive. Not to China, but to us. The fact that there's so many good things about China that nobody knows about is offensive. That we are supposed to be in this society where we can be, we have access to information so freely, yet we're focusing on all the negatives. But the worst thing about it is that most of those negatives are fake. And I'm not going to get into it in this video, but so many of the things that Westerners take as fact about China are so easily proven wrong. And I'm not going to get into that video here, because then it's going to go down too deep of a rabbit hole. But the offensive thing about that is that we've been inundated with so much anti-Chinese propaganda that we're not even willing to look at those goods. We're saying, well, you know what, a country that does A, B, C, I don't even want to hear anybody talk about why China's good. And so maybe that's the purpose of the propaganda. Maybe it's the propaganda working as intended. It's supposed to do that, to get people to a point where they're like, don't even tell me anything about it. And so I find that offensive, that we are in a free society where we're supposed to be able to get balanced opinions, ideas, have discussions, and we still default to the side of ignorance, particularly when you consider how long our media has lied to us about whatever it may be, weapons of mass destruction in Iraq or anything like that. We're continually lied to, and we just believe them the next time. We're like, oh yeah, okay, this must be true. And we have an illusion of freedom because we do have a lot of debate and discussion in our media, but it really focuses more along the lines of left versus right, doesn't it? But it's really remarkable how bipartisan a lot of the media becomes when it's about foreign policy related issues, when it's about attacking a particular country or demonizing a particular country. Of course there are outliers, but more or less the mass of the discussion, the majority of the discussion kind of falls in line. So it's the presence of that gap and the implications of what that gap means, how it should be considered offensive towards ourselves. Next is going to be a little bit more identity related, and maybe I should start with a couple of stories. So I remember seeing this guy get up on stage in Canada. He's a PhD, and he was talking about identity, and he was talking about, he was a guy from India, and I don't want to mention his name because he's one of my father's colleagues. My father, he has his PhD in social work, and he wrote an entire book on anti-oppressive practices, which is probably going to boggle the minds of even more people, because here I am saying positive things about China, which you think is an extremely oppressive country, and my father is a specialist on anti-oppressive practices. And he speaks up for child welfare and the rights of the native, like First Nations and all of the other tribes in Canada. And maybe that's something I'll talk about in another video. That's my famous catchphrase, isn't it? But one of his colleagues gets up and he does this speech on identity. And he came from India when he was 5 years old, and he was talking about how offensive the question is, where are you from? And I really dislike that, because as much as I talk about racism, you would think I'm one of these guys to jump on the bandwagon every time somebody says racist. And in fact, I think the word is overused in so many cases. And I didn't like his talk about saying, where are you from, is offensive, because it creates this environment where people walk around on eggshells around people who they might really be curious in. They want to know where they're from. The question may be asked in the wrong way, especially if it goes to the second layer question when they say, where are you from? And they say, oh, I'm from here, from Canada. And they're like, no, but where are you really from? I don't think when people ask a question like that, it's an ignorant question. It's an ignorant way to ask it, but I don't think it comes from a place from hate. It comes from a place of genuine curiosity, and we're killing people's curiosity and making them say, we need to be careful around these people. And I spoke with my dad about it too, who didn't initially agree with some of my points, but he came back and said, you know what, there's some truth to this, because I remember, there was a student in my class that they sounded like they had a Guyanese accent, and of course my mom is from Guyana, and he really wanted to ask, but he had to be really careful about it, because there are people who get offended by these questions about being asked where they're from. But when you really listen to his talk, he was talking about how, so first of all, I knew that this was more of a personal issue than anything else, because the one thing he wanted to do was emphasize his accent. He says, where do I sound like I'm from? I more or less sound like I grew up here. And I could have been reading that into that a little bit too much, but it seemed like he took pride in the fact that he had a Canadian accent, and I could have been reading into that a little bit too much, but there was something else later on that tied into it a little bit better, which was he talked about, he said, you can understand why he might not want to be associated with India, because when we think of India, we think of poverty and strife. And I was like, really? I said, no, I don't. I've never been to India, but that's not what I think about. And this is the real reason. This is the real reason. This is just something you don't want to be associated with. It's not about highlighting your true identity. It's about distancing yourself from that. And in so many cases of people that have identity issues, I found that's the case. It's about them wanting to distance themselves from something. And so I spoke about it a little bit in a video. I was interviewed by CGTN, and I spoke about wanting my kids to grow up proud of the Chinese part of their identity, and worried that if we move overseas eventually, or they go to school overseas, if they'll be taught to distance themselves from that, because there's so many negative things being said about China. And it's very difficult to separate from China or the Chinese government. People are going to wrap that up together. And my goal isn't to lie to these people and say, you really should be proud of China, and let me try to convince you to be proud of China. No, actually, I'm working with something here. I'm working with the fact that there is a lot to be proud of in terms of development, poverty alleviation, from what the people are doing on the ground here, even the government. And so that's why I want to put that out there. For those people who might be going through an identity crisis and saying, I don't want to associate with this part of my identity, because I just don't want to be mixed up in that. There's so many negative things about China, and it's based on a false premise. So I want to correct that. I grew up in a town that was pretty much all white. And of course I experienced racism, but I came out of it okay, and I'm actually glad I had those experiences. It shaped a lot of the ways that I think through things. And so, but the thing I do see is that not everybody comes out like that. And it also makes me remember of something I'm really ashamed of. And I think about it to this day, and I wish I knew who this person was, and I wish I could apologize to them. So I was already a little bit of an outlier at school. So I'm an ethnic minority. There weren't really any visible minorities in my school. And I liked all different things too. You know, when my friends were talking about Power Rangers, I'd rather talk about Star Trek: The Next Generation. Nobody was watching Star Trek: The Next Generation. There was another kid who I started to become a bit of friends with, but he was way too much of an outlier to really buddy up with too much, because then we'd be like, you know, a double negative. I don't know if that's supposed to make a positive, but he used to walk home the same direction as me, and we used to talk, and he was from England. He had a thick British accent, and he introduced me to like British comedy, like Blackadder and stuff like that, and I found it fascinating, but none of the other kids would have understood that stuff. But so anyways, I was an outlier for a number of reasons, but I fit in quite well. I had a lot of friends, and I did a good job of fitting in. And there was one day when school was over, I was walking home, and there was a lady coming up with her son. He must have been, so I must have been in grade 5, I think, and the kid must have been in grade 2 or something like that. He was a couple of years younger. And this woman in a sari sees me in Indian clothing, and she comes up to me, and her eyes light up, and she's so happy to see me. And she says, "Oh, you know, where are you from?" in a very thick Indian accent and stuff like that. She said, "Are you from India?" And I said, "No, I'm not from India." And I remember having a real sense of anxiety, saying, I can't be associated with these people. You know, this is going to make me even more of an outlier. And I feel so bad about it, because to have a kid starting school halfway through the year, it doesn't matter if you look different from everybody else. It's already difficult. And here she is moving to this white town. They just moved to town, and she was probably having some of her own anxiety about how her son would fit into the school. And she finally finds somebody else who's brown. And she wanted so much to make a connection with me, and maybe hope that I would look out for her son. And I totally brushed them off. Sorry, I had to pause that for a second. I get kind of emotional telling that story, because it's something I'm really ashamed of. And I think how, I don't know what happened to the kid after. I'm sure he's okay, but I think having some regret about that, what happened there, drives me to want to say something about this in a larger format, so that potentially, if Chinese kids are out there seeing this fake news about China, this ignorant rhetoric about China, these, you know, white dudes getting on social media and just bashing their country all day, when there's so many good things to say about China. I hope that by doing this, I've connected with some of these kids, and I've made up for my sin, so to speak, from when I was a kid. And I don't know, you know, I have had people reach out to me, and they said that they thanked me, and they said they know a kid who doesn't want to learn Mandarin Chinese because of all of this rhetoric that's going on. And he sent my videos to him to look at. And so that's one of the things. That's the other thing that really really drives me. And that's probably why I'm okay with all of the negativity that comes around saying good things about China, because it's worth it for me. It's worth it. If even a couple of people look at this and say, you know what, I think I've got China all wrong. I think maybe there's so much better about China that I never thought of. And I get it, because there's a piece that I speak about in terms of the government doing a lot of good things here, and that's a weird thing to do. You know, I have one of the teachers, he's an American guy at my son's school, and I was having beer with him outside. It was a non-school event. And we really connect. He says I remind him a lot of his dad, because, you know, I listen to philosophy podcasts with my kids. I talk about philosophy with them, and he says it reminds him so much of his dad. And one thing he said to me, and it really got me, it was a really good thing to say, to be condescending, even though he didn't mean to be condescending. He said, you know, Daniel, he said, you're a smart guy. I always thought you were a smart guy, but then you're talking, you're this pro-China guy. Like, it's like those things don't go together. And it like mind boggled him. And he hasn't been here for that long, and he's got his own understanding of China. And I get it, I understand it. And as a matter of fact, if this was 2008, you know, when I first arrived in China 12 years ago, I wouldn't be making this content. Because 2008 was very different from now. part of my impression comes from the progress that they've made in the last 12 years, the amount of corruption that they've cracked down on. And I can give firsthand examples of that. How my Chinese friends feel when they're interacting with the government here, when they've got things that they've got to get done. So when people talk to me about the Great Leap or all of this stuff before, don't even talk to me about that stuff. You even say 2008. If China today looked like it looked like in 2008, I wouldn't be speaking up about it. But because I've been given this unique opportunity that there's a massive disconnect between what people think about China and the reality of China, the reality of how great China is. And because it ties into this possibility of convincing some kids out there to connect with the Chinese part of their identity a bit more. And to lay maybe the framework for my own kids to be proud of that. They know that I am very positive about China, and I hope that will help them grow up where they are proud of that part of their identity. You know, when we're outside and people say to me, oh, your kids, they speak Chinese so well. My response to them is, that's because they are Chinese. Of course, they're more than just Chinese, but that's my default response. And so, I mean, those are some of the things that drive me. I've gone on a little bit too long here, but I wanted to make this a little bit more personal. I've missed a bunch of stuff about some of the reasons that drive me to make this content, and I'm probably going to cover it in future videos. And once we're through this coronavirus stuff, and hopefully there's nothing else that divides me politically with you guys again in the future, and I can focus on making some more positive stuff about China in terms of this is why I love this country. You know, I almost went in that direction after the Hong Kong stuff, and I got sick of the Hong Kong stuff, and you saw me making road trip videos, RV videos, and then this stuff happened. Something where we have divided opinions on across the globe again. So I'm just going to cut this short here. I'm going to cut this short here, and I'll see you in the next video. I don't know if I'm still going to be able to do daily vlogs, but hopefully I've given you a little bit of an insight into why I do what I do, and I will, I'll just see you guys next time. So stay safe, take all the precautions you should be taking during this time, and I'll catch you next time, guys. Peace.